the Tea Act was passed by Parliament in 1773 after all the other acts had been repealed. Well, what happened after the Boston Massacre is England got the message, so to speak. They understood now that the colonists were angry, and this caused bloodshed. So in reaction to that, they pulled back and they repealed every single act they'd ever passed on the colonies except for one, and that'd be the Tea Act. Well, here's the reason why they didn't repeal the Tea Act. The Tea Act was something that would actually make tea cheaper in the colonies. And the purpose of the Tea Act for England was not to tax the colonists, but to give sole rights to the sale of tea to a struggling company in England called the East India Company. They were a tea company. And if you know anything about the English, they love their tea time. And to them, that was just everything. They loved tea, and they had it multiple times per day. So it was a very important staple in England as well as in the colonies, because the colonists are obviously, most of them are of English descent. So they love tea. Well, so they would get their tea cheaper, and here's why. The East India Company would be responsible for coming into the harbors and setting up shop right on the docks where people could come and buy their tea directly from the East India Company, which cuts out the middleman being the merchants. And the merchants wouldn't be paid because they were not going to be able to sell tea, which was something that sold really well, obviously, in the stores. But now they weren't going to be able to sell it. So the merchants were not happy. But again, understand this, that the colonists were getting their tea for cheaper, because if it were to go to the merchant would have to raise the price so they can make a profit. So it just gives you a little bit more insight now of what's going to happen next, and just how angry the colonists are. And even though they're getting their tea for cheaper, they're still willing to demonstrate against mother country England for what was happening. And so the result of this was the Boston Tea Party. There were ships in the harbor, British ships, that were loaded down with tea. They were waiting to get permission to come ashore and sell their tea. In the middle of the night, a group led by the Sons and Daughters of Liberty and Samuel Adams got liquored up, dressed up as Indians, took rowboats out to the ships, boarded them, broke into an area of the ship where the tea was being stored, and dumped thousands of pounds of tea. As a matter of fact, 90,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor, while people that were ashore were cheering and were excited and enthusiastic. The Boston Tea Party is 100% a symbolic act. Nobody was killed. Nobody was killed or hurt in this, but 90,000 pounds of tea was dumped into Boston Harbor. So once again, more evidence, this as well as the Boston Massacre, that the colonists in Boston mean business. This is where the anger is directed at England, but this is where the colonists are most upset, is in Boston. It seems to be where most of the agitation is happening. So it's a symbolic act to show, just how angry things had become. The committees of correspondence, it's important that you understand what the committees of correspondence were. And to help you relate to what it was the phone tree of the colonies. And what I mean by that, it was a way to communicate. Nowadays, we know we could get a hold of anybody really quickly with the cell phone. And we get actually frustrated if we call somebody and they don't answer. We need to get in communication if we want to talk to somebody, we need to be in communication with them immediately. That's just the way we become. But back then, the only way to speak to somebody was, right in front of you, was face to face or by messenger. The committee correspondence was just a chain of of groups, like they would, a message would, for example, if there was a message that wanted to be sent to somebody in another community, the committee of correspondence in, say, Boston would go and get the message, and someone would go by horseback to get the message to, say, Lexington, and then on to Concord and other of the small areas that surrounded Boston. So each community had their own committee of correspondence and were responsible for getting messages out to everybody else. And this was to keep track of what the Redcoats were doing in some of these communities. New York had their committees of correspondence. Philadelphia had their committees of correspondence. So anyway, it was a very important way to communicate in the colonies. And Samuel Adams played a big role in this, as well as the sons and daughters of Liberty. Now, in order to punish the colonists for their actions in the Boston Tea Party, Great Britain passed what they called the Coercive Acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts because they weren't going to tolerate them. So the Intolerable Acts or Coercive Acts were punishment for what happened to the Boston Tea Party and consisted of a series of 4 laws. The first one being the Boston Port Act, which was severe. It shut down the port of Boston. Not a single ship could come in or out, whether they're trading, whether they're fishing. It 100% shut down the port. And the port of Boston is the lifeblood of Boston. It's where they did most of their business. So that was harsh. The Charter of Massachusetts was revoked. They became a royal colony, which meant the king was 100% in charge. Any restrictions, any town meetings, there were restrictions put on them. They couldn't have town meetings. British officials who were accused of crimes would be charged in Great Britain instead of in the colonies, which pretty much guaranteed they could do whatever they want to control the rambunctious Boston colonists. And if they happened to hurt or kill somebody, well, they would be taken, the Redcoats would be taken back to England, and the trial would be there. And there's no witnesses there, so they would most likely get off on the charges. So the Intolerable Acts were severe, and the colonists were really angry at that. So angry that, I'll talk about the Quebec Act later, but so angry that they called a meeting of the First Continental Congress. This was a 100% response to the Intolerable Acts. There were 55 delegates from 12 colonies. All colonies sent delegates to this meeting except for Georgia, and Georgia couldn't make it because of distance barriers. The meeting was in Philadelphia at Carpenter Hall, which you see the picture of right there. And they were meeting there to, as they said, consider ways of redressing colonial grievances, which meant they were going to list all the things they were angry with England about, and they were going to tell them about that. But most of all, they're upset because of the Intolerable Acts. They deliberated, meaning they met for 7 weeks from September to October of 1774. And here's what their accomplishments were. They drew up a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, and they sent it to King George III in England. And he promptly just dismissed that, didn't even look at them. The other thing they did is they created what's called the Association, which was an organization who were in charge of boycotting British goods. They were going to take boycott to another level. Obviously, boycotting had been really, really successful, repealed the Stamp Act. Now they were going to extend it to non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption of British goods, meaning they weren't going to import to them, they were not exporting anything to England, and they were not consuming any goods. And lastly, there's Carpenter Hall there. They decided that if the Intolerable Acts were not repealed within 1 year, that they would meet again. So they were going to give them 1 year to address that. And of course, that before anything happened, the Battle of Lexington and Concord occurred, and the war was on. It was April of 1775. The British Redcoats had heard rumors that the colonists were stockpiling weapons in Concord, a small town not far away. It'd be the equivalent of if Boston were Salinas, okay, just to help you understand the distance here between these communities. Boston were Salinas, then Arlington would be Marina, and Concord would be Seaside. So there you go. It'd be from Concord, where they stored the weapons, would be as far as Seaside. Walkable distance, but it would take you quite some time. So the Redcoats heard about that stockpiling of weapons in Concord, and they also knew that there were two rebel rousers, guys that kind of riled up the colonists and got them, angry and tried to get them to rebel. And they were John Hancock and Samuel Adams, and both of them lived in Lexington, the equivalent of living in Marina from Salinas. So the plan was to go. The Redcoats were going to walk. They were going to leave really early morning before the light, well before light, like 3:00 in the morning, and they were going to walk to Lexington. And they were going to get to Lexington before the sun rose, and they were going to rouse Hancock and Adams out of their bed and arrest them. And then they were going to leave there very early morning and get to Concord late morning and take all the weapons and stop any kind of insurrection from happening. That was the plan. Well, it just so happened that somebody, a doctor, couldn't sleep and was walking, going up for a walk in the middle of the night, and heard the commotion and hid in a bush and was able to decipher what the plan was. So he was able to go and alert the committees of correspondence, who told Paul Revere and Dawes and Prescott, two others, that this was going to happen. And this is where the midnight ride of Paul Revere occurred. And it also included Prescott and Dawes. And they were going along the road to Lexington, and then on to Concord. And they were alerting people that the British are coming. All three of them were arrested by the British. The first to be arrested was Paul Revere. He actually warned the least amount of people about Lexington and Concord. And actually, Paul Revere is the most well-known because of Longfellow's poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. That's why we know who he is. But the troops left early morning, not knowing that Revere, Dawes, and Prescott were warning people, and they actually did. Revere and Dawes and Prescott alerted enough people that they were able to rouse Adams and Hancock out of their bed, and they were hiding. And when the British got to Lexington, they didn't find or capture Adams or Hancock. So they were about to leave. Oh, yeah, I'll tell you about that in a second. But there's a sketch of the Redcoats that are leaving Lexington on their way to Concord. The troops didn't find what they were looking for, but they now were going to go on to Concord, and they met in a field there just before they were leaving. And that's when a number of colonists were there to try to stop them. Unfortunately, the colonists had about 50 or 60 people, and the Redcoats had about 3,000 people. So it wasn't a fair fight. There was a shot that went off. There were 70 Minutemen versus 3,000 to 5,000 troops. A shot went off, didn't hit anyone, but some colonists were injured in this small skirmish that happened at Lexington. That was pretty insignificant, although they do call it the shot heard round the world, because it's really the official start of the Revolutionary War, and the outcome is going to be huge. The British actually had one killed, and the Minutemen, they were called, the militia, had 8 killed and 10 wounded. So the war is on, really, but it definitely did not stop the British, the Redcoats, from going on to Concord as they went to Concord. But before they got to Concord, the fruits of the labor of Hancock and Revere and Prescott, Revere, and Dawes, the fruits of their labor finally came to fruition there at the North Bridge in Concord, where thousands of militia now met the Redcoats, and they outnumbered them 2-1, and they were able to stop the redcoats from crossing over the Old North Bridge to get to Concord. They never got there, and they chased them all the way back to Boston. And it was pretty miraculous. It was wild. People had heard all throughout, Boston and the surrounding areas. They heard about the small skirmish that happened at Lexington, and they were really, really fired up and excited to get to fight this battle. And they all showed up. That's the thing about militia, man. You never knew how many were going to show up, but it just so happens at Concord, they had a great showing, and they were able to push the redcoats all the way back, chase them basically all the way back to Boston, and then totally surround them there. So it was a rousing success in the beginning here, but it just shows you just the flaws, the good things and the bad things about a militia. The militia, could show up in small numbers like they did at Lexington, or huge numbers like they did at Concord, and that was always an issue until they got an official army. They really had a hard time relying on militia. There's a sketch of Minutemen there. They were called that because they could be ready in a minute's notice. They were the militia of Boston. Now, lastly, in this chapter, I really want to break down the battle, like who's fighting against who, what the advantages and disadvantages are. It appears that the British have just a huge advantage when it comes to numbers and when it comes to wealth. I mean, they're the strongest country in the world at the time. They're a superpower. And America isn't even a country yet. So the British had, first off, a population advantage of 7.5 million to the Americans 2 million. Not that that really matters, because all 7.5 million of the British were not there fighting. They had a superior naval power. They were the strongest navy in the world. They had more wealth. They had recovered from the French and Indian War. They also had hired soldiers. They were called mercenary soldiers. They were Hessians. They were from Germany. Basically, they fought for money. And then the fact that the Americans had a lack of unity was also a British advantage. Now, when it comes to the American advantages, when you look at it deeper, you find out that the British were going to have a really, really, really tough time defeating the Americans, because America is big. And how do you take over the entire eastern seaboard? Do you take over big cities and then hope that they surrender? That's kind of what their game plan is going to be. But America had home field advantage. As I said, the British had to control a huge amount of territory, and there's going to be some leaders that emerge like George Washington, Ben Franklin, Samuel Adams. The Americans are eventually going to get French aid, and the Americans enjoyed the moral advantage of fighting for a just cause. So they're going to be able to get this done. When you look at it, it's like, how could the British have won this thing? They were going to have to beat the Americans so badly that the Americans cry uncle and just give up. And that's not going to happen. So those are some of the advantages and disadvantages of this war. And that concludes this chapter. And the next chapter is going to get into the actual, deeper into the fighting of the Revolutionary